Uh, we have a topic which we cannot cover even in a day, and we have speakers who will hardly find time to express themselves completely. I mean their ideas on Indian literature. So we are confining ourselves to practically a single theme. Is there an Indian literature? I mean, this is going to be the central theme of discussion. Because whenever nations have been born or given birth to, they have also, along with that, generated the idea of a national literature, along with other things like national flag, national animal, national bird, whatnot. And so, can we include literature also in that category as something that becomes a symbol that or a metaphor that integrates the whole nation, or should we be speaking of different Indian literatures? Should we use it in plural in order to actually reflect the ground reality, which is that of a diverse literature? With of course there are common points, but there are also periods of isolated growth. There are common genres, but there are also genres which are very specific to languages. So these are some of the questions that we will address in a short while. I don't want to take much time as a moderator. I will just present this question in 3 sentences, which are not mine. One is, there is this concept by Nihar Ranjan Ray, the well-known Bengali critic, who said that we cannot have an Indian literature because we don't have a language called the Indian language. We have so many languages, and so we can only have many literatures, and there cannot be a single Indian literature. And the second statement which contradicts it, that was a statement made by S. Radhakrishnan, who was the president of the Republic, and also, as you know, a well-known thinker. So he said, that is what used to be the maxim of the Sahitya Academy, well, until I took over, by the way. That is, Indian literature is one, even though it is written in different languages. That is another statement. And there is a third statement which U.R. Ananthamurthy casually almost made in one of his speeches. He said, if we look for the unity of Indian literature, we come across its vast diversity. And if you look for diversity, you come to see some points of unity, which is perhaps a kind of dialectical statement on what Indian literature looks like. So I think this is a kind of starting point from which I hope the speakers will take off and express their ideas of Indian literature. Do they believe in a single Indian literature or in different Indian literatures, and what are the kinds of relationships that one can conceive among the different literatures of India? Shall I start? I'll start with Alok.
Thank you. Thank you, Sachi. You have already expressed one thing that I wanted to say about the title, because I found the title very difficult. I thought that if one talked about the great Indian literature, one could only say Indian literature is great because it's great, and that would be tautological. But the second thing that was important here, and I thought one could think positively about this, that the title needs to be changed, and you've already hinted at that. It should be Indian literatures, because if we don't say that, then we miss out on everybody from Panini and Bulle Shah to Manto and Intezar Hussain. And I think we should include that in the notion that we think about a large Indian civilization where there is a certain kind of commonality. Having said that, I want to approach the subject slightly differently, if I may. Not address the issue of whether there is an Indian literature or no, but to tell you 2 stories. Stories which some of you already know, but they're worth repeating because, to my mind, they exemplify some of the things that would be essential for thinking about the greatness of the literary tradition. The first one is a very tiny one. At the end of the Mahabharata, when the Pandavas have won and the Kauravas have lost and the kingdoms have been formed, after many years, Arjun is in distress. And he turns to Krishna and says, Krishna, before the war started, you preached the Gita. Can you tell me what you said at that time? Because I have forgotten. And Krishna hums and haws and says, hey Arjuna, strangely enough, I have also forgotten what I said during the Gita, but I can try to tell you another Gita. I think that's the crucial part here, that I can tell you another Gita. On the first sight, it seems like a witty story, but I think there is a profundity here which needs to be talked about in some detail, which I will if I have some time. The second story is actually the first Indian story written, and it's strangely enough called the Brihatta Katha, which really means the great Indian narrative. And it is the first story. The origin of this story is mythic. And I just want to narrate that mythic story in its Saransh form, in its Reader's Digest form. Shiva and Parvati are sitting on the mountain top, quite bored. And Parvati turns to Shiva and says, tell me a story which nobody else has ever told. So Shiva tells a story about 7 kings. And she also has another condition, that nobody else should hear it. So Shiva tells the story which runs into 600,000 verses. But as he's telling the story, Shiva's own man in waiting, a man called Pushpadanta, overhears the story. And he tells it to his wife Jaya, who in turn, of course, tells it to Parvati. And Parvati is incensed. She thinks that Shiva has betrayed her, and she actually, after she finds out that this is a Pushpadanta who's told the story, exiles him to earth and says, you will be born on earth as your punishment. This is important. So your punishment is that you will be born as a human being, and you will be redeemed only after you tell the story to a yaksha, who in turn tells a story to another person in not the languages you know, but in a language called Payaschi. I can't pronounce it correctly. And that man will write it down. And once that process happens, you will be redeemed and returned to paradise. Well, this guy is born as a Sanskrit Pandit This guy is born as a Sanskrit Pandit in the court of a king, and there he knows Sanskrit and Prakrit. But he loses a bet. And when he loses a bet, as in India, this is one of the characteristics of ancient India, that if the Pandit loses his bet, either he loses his head, which is chopped off, or he's sent off in exile. He goes to live in a forest. And there in the forest, he starts reciting the stories that he had heard in paradise. And when he starts reciting them, the yaksha hears the stories. But he hears them not in Sanskrit and not in Prakrit, but in Payaschi. And he tells it to a man called Gundaya, who writes it down. So he is actually the first writer in the Indian tradition. Now Gundaya writes it down and takes it to his king and presents the entire manuscript to the king. And Gundaya writes it in his blood, because there is no ink that he has. So he writes it in his blood. This is crucial too, that he writes it in his blood. And the king is incensed and repulsed, and rejects the manuscript. So in effect, he's the first Indian editor, or the first Indian publisher, who does not recognize the value of a manuscript and sends it back. So this guy now gets back into the forest completely distressed and distraught, a fate that many of us writers face in modern times, and starts reading or reciting and singing his stories in the forest. And as he does so, the birds and the animals get enchanted. And because they get enchanted, they form a circle around him and listen to the stories. Now the problem is that once the animals circle around the storyteller, the king has no meat left in his palace, and the cooks have nothing to cook. So the king comes to try to investigate as to where the animals and birds have gone, and why the trees are sitting around this guy listening to stories. And as this man is singing the stories of 600,000 shlokas, he begins to burn them after reciting them. And he burns 500,000 stories, or 500,000 shlokas. And when the king comes to the forest and finds him burning his stories, burning his manuscript, he stops him from doing this. So the first Indian manuscript is of 100,000 stories, which is a fragment. It's crucial here. This is a fragment. And Gundaya, this fragment forms part of Kathasarita Sagar and so on and so forth. And the point I'm trying to make is that the great Indian story, or the great story, or the great literature, is always that which is first discovered, then forgotten, and then rediscovered. And it's in this rediscovery of literature that its greatness resides, and its retelling that its greatness resides. So that's the first point I really want to make. One, that great literature is inspired, of course, but great literature, when it's inspired, gets lost, is forgotten, and then has to be rediscovered by every reader in his or her own way and recreated. That's one part. The other part is, of course, that great Indian literature is always incomplete. There are parts of 500,000 shlokas which have been lost. So it's the task of every writer who follows to rediscover those 500,000 shlokas or reinvent literature. So they have to reinvent it. The third part I want to make, the small part I want to make, is that great literature is also always exists in rediscovery. It has an afterlife. Ordinary, common, simple, uninteresting page 3 literature does not have an afterlife. And great literature does. So I'm trying to suggest this to you, that great literature is always rediscovered in every different age. And I want to just quickly reconsider this point here. A text like Antigone is rediscovered by 200 people, including Kamila Shamshi recently last year, who is a Pakistani writer, who rewrites Antigone in London. Or you have Oedipus, who is rediscovered by Freud, if I may so say so. Or you have Socrates' Apologia, which is rediscovered by Gandhi, who then coins the phrase called Karam Yogi on the basis of his reading of Socrates. And so it also is that all great literature, as the Yaksha story tells you, must be so constructed as to involve not only the social issues, because the texts written only about social issues could well also be done by editorials. And by and large, what is being written sometimes could be dismissed as editorials. But it must take into account the entire shrishti upon which our lives depend. They depend on the animals, they depend on the birds, they depend on the trees, and they depend on as the Brihatara Katha suggests. The last point I want to make is that the great Indian literature, and of which there is a plenty amount, and others will talk about it, the great Indian literature is written by a man or a woman for whom the sufferings of the world are sufferings and will not let him rest. Great Indian literature, or great literature anywhere, is written by a person who really walks amongst the dead and with the dead. And until and unless he has endured that suffering, that is, he has written the text in blood, in his blood, as in the case of Gundaya, the first writer of Indian fiction or Indian stories. He's also a poet, by the way. So that the great Indian literature is always and only that, in which the writer has endured, experienced, and known suffering. Last point I want to make. Therefore, the two of the greatest epics written in India, one of course being the Ramayana, which is written, as you all know, at the site of the killing of a conch bird. And when Valmiki cries, he cries a shloka He cries in shok. And so he is deeply offended and distraught by the suffering and the cry of the bird. And it's not just the cry and the suffering of the bird being shot by a hunter, but it's the suffering and cry of a bird in the midst of making love. That is, the process of generativity of the earth is stopped. And hence Valmiki's anguish. The second part is that, if I just use the Mahabharata example, the retelling of the Gita in the Mahabharata is at the end of a huge amount of pain and sorrow. And therefore the Mahabharata actually opens, many of you don't know this, many of the Mahabharata actually opens with a lamentation. That is its first major verse that is spoken, and is spoken interestingly by the man who is lost, that is Dhritarashtra, who then says, I wish I had known, I would have acted differently. So with that, for some points, let me just stop.
Good evening, everybody. I thank Mr. Ravi DC and Professor K. Satchidanadan for inviting me here to speak to you. I'll make my presentation very brief. It has mainly two parts. One is my memory of about 22 years ago when I was in Germany, in Humboldt University. There was this presentation on Indian literature, which my host insisted that I should attend. I went there and I found a Hindi scholar making a presentation claiming it to be, the whole of Indian literature. So I sat through for about half an hour. When during the question-answer session, I said, but this is only Hindi literature. This is not an Indian literature. Then the professor, the venerable professor who was there, the German, he said, Hindi is the official language of India. So Hindi literature is Indian literature. I said, I beg to disagree. This is not the case. There are 24 different literatures of India. At that time, 22, yeah. And I said, we have as many literatures as you have here in Europe. India is almost like Europe. My point is now to bring your attention to the question of how the world sees Indian literature. They don't know. In most of the cases, I think many of us here sitting here, they have experience of the Frankfurt Book Fair or the London Book Fair, many book fairs outside. And how many of them, how many of the participants know that we have 24 different regional languages which the Sahitya Academy approves or recognizes, and which are quite different, which Professor Satchidanadan and Professor Alok Bhalla now said can be described as Indian literatures in the plural. This is the point. We have different literatures which are, developed and thriving in different parts of India in different languages, which are maybe very flimsily interrelated by way of our epic tradition or the tradition of the Puranas, which of course, as a little while ago Professor Satchidanandan pointed out in a personal discussion, excludes the Northeast. The Northeastern languages or literatures won't have this epic tradition. So they will be excluded if we say that Indian literatures have something common like the epics connecting them. No. So that won't be the scenario. So what do we have essentially? We have these different literatures of India, which if we want to take the literatures outside the country in translation through various means of like Indian literature abroad, there are various projects that take our literatures outside. through competent translations, of course, and publishers and agencies dealing with those things, government agencies and the private agencies. I don't know how successful they are, because we are getting a lot of South American literature or European literature, English and other French or any other literatures that we get here. They have such a preponderance in our market, but can we make our literatures saleable maybe, or make them as popular as South American literature, for example, is in India? These are questions that we have to confront and evaluate our own literatures, like a kind of introspection, beginning with Malayalam, for example. We have, maybe I used to boast about some 20 years ago, that we have short stories at least, which are world standard. When I was doing my MPhil about 26 years ago, in my dissertation I made this claim, but I'm growing skeptical over the years. I don't know. When I know more and more about other literatures and other short fiction that I come across, this claim may not be that kind of valid claim, but we have our strengths also. So when we represent our literatures through translation outside, we bring about the true value. So whatever of value will remain. But I think if we make judicious selections of the literatures that we translate and show to the world, I think that will be a great thing. So it involves a lot of selection, judicious translation, editing, all that. Number two, the point that I want to make here is the term Indian literature is the title of a journal, a bi-monthly English journal by Sahitya Academy. It's been there for 60 years now. And incidentally, there were 4 former editors of Indian literature around. Shiva Prakash left yesterday. And on this stage, we have Professor Satchidanadan sitting here. He gave a different, orientation to the journal in 1993 when he joined as editor. He is the first person who, I think, made it a kind of literary journal of the kind we, think about now, because he brought in strands like Dalit literature, women's literature, literature of the environment, literature of the margins, of the tribes, all that he began. So we who followed Shiva Prakash and then Mr. Nirmal Bhattacharya sitting there, we were all colleagues together, and last of all I became the editor, and now I am the guest editor, which means I am a consultant, like that. But I'm going on for the 3rd year now. Just in July, I'll complete 3 years now as a guest editor. It goes on. It's a kind of contract appointment, so I can't say that I'm the editor. So this goes on. And this journal is a very unique journal. I don't know, because in an earlier session, Krishnan sitting here in the audience was pointing out how Sahitya Academy and NBT are repositories of valuable material on Indian literature, but the kind of distribution system, or to use practical terminology, marketing, how it is almost absent, because we have something like a big festival like this going on here. If Sahitya Academy can open a stall here or make its presence here and bring the books here and sell it, if it happens, it's a very big question if. But Sahitya Academy is going around the country, attending major Indian literature festivals. And if we can do this, I think we can share through Indian literature what we have always, wish for an integration of the country through Indian literature. Thank you.
Satchidanadan has made a few, he has problematized the very idea of a unitary Indian literature. I would begin by saying, we are asking this question, is there an Indian literature, in the context of 2019. There is no other context which is available to us. Let's not assume we can go back and look at this question from many other vantage points. No. Then we need to ask, how did we arrive here? Something remarkable happens in this subcontinent between the 8th century and 15th century. And that's the emergence of modern Indian languages. And this is a cultural kind of defining moment when about 20, 25, maybe if you take South Asia, it may be more than 50 languages emerge. I'm not going into that story, but they translated, they assimilated, and in the 19th century, when we were face to face with an imperial power and the great colonial, enterprise, Indian languages held on their own. That's nothing short of magic, because countries like Latin American countries, most of them lost their languages. If today India remains democratic, let us actually state it very clearly, it's because of the multiple Indian languages. It's because of the plurality of Indian linguistic situation. So we cannot desegregate, or we cannot actually separate this question of Indian literature from the larger question of Indian democratic question. There is a progressive democratization of India which is happening through Indian languages. I also would actually say culture, as often and as always, is a terrain of struggle between competing forces. There is a unitary centrifugal forces, one away from the center, one toward the center. So it's quite natural. Central agencies like Sahitya Academy, NBT, or maybe Culture Ministry or universities, they will all want to sort of bring culture as a manageable enterprise which they can domesticate and also tame. But the great creativity of Indian languages, they resist this domestication. And that's what we have seen time and again, whether it's Bhakti literature, whether it's the origin of the novel, whether it is the emergence of Dalit literature, women's literature, or recent environmental kind of consciousness in literature. From the margins, people speak. And I would very strongly argue Indian literatures still are living literatures, mainly because they cannot be totally amalgamated, assimilated, domesticated into manageable cultural kind of forms. Their inherent plurality, their inherent multiplicity, that's what actually we should be, I wouldn't use the word proud, we should actually acknowledge. I'll give 2-3 examples. Your Anandamurthy was put a very simple question by Saul Bellow. Saul Bellow asked him, tell me one Indian text which you would actually say represents Indian literature. And he told him the story of one novel by Vaikam Muhammad Bashir, Patuma's Goat, Patumayude Aadu. And he actually chose a Malayalam text to actually represent, and this is important, when you cross the boundary of India, the idea of India becomes a unitary idea, definitely. I would also add, there is a wonderful novel by a Dalit writer in Canada, Devanur Mahadeva. He has written a novel called Udalaram. And what makes Udalaram a remarkable text is Devanur Mahadeva is inspired by Bashir. He is enabled by Bashir. And this is what we see time and again. Anand, a very important Malayalam writer who is here, he is Govardhan Yatragal. He is inspired by Harishchandra's, you see, Andheri Nagari Chaupat Raja, a text, a defining Indian text. The question of intertextuality, the question of crossing the boundary, the question of getting actually ideas from across the multiple languages. I repeatedly argue one cultural domain in India is inhabited by sometimes 3 languages, 4 languages, 5 languages. If you take Northeast as one cultural domain, look at the number of languages Northeast has. Kerala, if it's a cultural domain, there are definitely, Konkani is part of that cultural, even Kurgi language. There are so many minor languages. Today, perhaps, the question of minor languages are important. The question of text in minor languages, oral languages, languages without script, languages which have no print history, they are very important. And finally, I will also make one very important comment about translation. Perhaps we are stuck with a context where Indian literature is assembled in the languages of English through translation. Translation between Indian languages is increasingly getting less and less. I wouldn't say there is less between, but look at the kind of transaction between Tamil and Malayalam, or Kannada and Malayalam, or Marathi and Gujarati, or Hindi and Urdu, or Tamil and Telugu. You find increasingly we are stuck with English as the only language where we meet. Even today I am speaking in English. Many of us are English teachers. This is not an accident. I think there is an inherent danger in assembling Indian literature in a world language which is the most, I think, globalized language and the least receptive. It is very much less receptive. I say it with the example of translation. You see, English translates very little compared to many other world languages. So the last point I make, we need to actually look towards the minor, the marginal, and what we call the backyard. Anandamurthy also said there is a front yard where we speak English, there is a backyard where we speak mother tongue or even dialect. So Indian literature is not something created only in the front yard. We need to go back. We need to actually look at the margins, and perhaps we will have and this will actually keep changing. The configuration of Indian literatures will keep changing as long as India is a living society. The social dynamics of social, political and other changes that will inform and define this plurality of Indian literatures. Thank you.
I'm afraid we are running short of time, awfully short of time. I would only make a couple of points. You know, there's something called a collective presence when you look at the Indian languages. According to Dr. Ganesh Devi, there are about 600 languages. You forget this 24 authorized language and all. What about the languages in Tripura and all these northeastern states? In National Book Trust, where I was working for about 3 years, we had published books in 30 languages, including some spoken languages in Northeast. And they had good readership, acceptance. So this question of collective presence means there is a seen or unseen linkage between the Indian languages. And that's a very important. When Dr. Radhakrishnan made that loaded statement, India thinks in one language and writes in many languages, it means a lot to me. Again, in the National Book Trust logo, there's a simple Sanskrit sloka, Eka Sute Sagalam. What does it mean? All the flowers are strewn into one cord. one string. These are all Indian languages, although they don't specify certainly. But this means a lot. So we need not bother about all these things. The exotic words of unity and diversity and all that, just jargons, leave it at that. The Indian literature is there, bound to live there. I would only say, often in various fora I used to repeat, there's nothing like regional literature. This is a hangover of the British Raj. They used to talk derisively vernacular. What vernacular? Whether be it Malayalam or Kokborok in Tripura, we all write in Indian language. All the 600 languages are meant to flourish, because age-old tradition, culture, history, all these things are mingled together. So by and large, we all dream, we all write in any of these 600 languages, spoken, whether you have a script or not, or just as you say, Vamodi, spoken language, whatever it is, that is India. So leave alone all this unity and diversity. Let us be proud. And I would only say, in the NBT we had made some study. You see, there are how many countries where you have a government organization printing books in many languages? I doubt very much. Of course, there may be private publishers and things like that. 30 languages or 35 languages. So that means a lot. And I would only comment about an instance. When we send out our vehicle lorries to the northeast, containing books in all these regional languages, when we reach certain tribal areas, the kids come and touch the book, smell the book, turn the pages, because they don't know how to read. But they know that it is their language, not an approved language, not one which is authorized in the constitution. This is India, which means a lot. So when Dr. Radhakrishnan made that statement, that is a very loaded, meaningful statement. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mridula.
Well, there is hardly any time left, so I'm a woman, so I'll be both direct and brief. I want to, first of all, nobody will disagree with Alok Bhalla's statement that literature is about suffering and about the suffering of others, not your own suffering. So the great Indian literature is also about suffering. But the point is that, as Sethu said, there are 600 languages, and so there are 600 Indian literatures. So if you have to talk about Indian literature, you have to go on with these so many languages. But India is not the only country which has a large number of languages. China has a large number of languages, so has Russia. But they do not have written literature in each of those languages. That is what makes us special. So we cannot just say that there is one Indian literature. But there is something that unites. You know, Mahabharata is rewritten in every language. And Ramayana is less so, but Mahabharata is rewritten in every language. And I disagree with Ramakrishnan's statement that most translations are in English. I think most of the other Indian languages works, most of them are translated in Hindi. Like Nemade's Hindu was simultaneously translated in Hindi. Bal's Dozaknama was simultaneously translated in Hindi as it was written in Bangla. So I think if you know Hindi, at least you have access to, through translations of other works. But as everybody knows, translation is just half as good as the original work. So I would say that there is no harm in there being diversity, in there being a whole number of Indian literatures and not one Indian literature. It does not make us less of a nation. It makes us more of a nation if we have and are putting up with so many linguistic cultures and so many linguistic literatures. I'll say only that, so I leave time for Nirmal Kanti to say something.
Perhaps you are aware that West Bengal government has passed a bill in the assembly for changing the name of West Bengal to Bengal. Now, do you know the reason? Reason is not philosophical, no, there is no ideology behind it. Reason is that when all the state chief ministers sit in Delhi and Prime Minister takes the meeting, the state chief ministers are called according to alphabet. And W being the last alphabet, she becomes the last speaker. Now, Mamata Banerjee cannot be the last. So she thought that if it is Bengal, she will be the second speaker. Now, if I had known that it will start from that side, I would have sat there, not here, Anyway, I still have 4 minutes left. Jokes apart, I would cast my vote, and I'd cast my vote very strongly with Sethu that, of course, there is an Indian literature. We should not doubt it at all. Forgetting all these, statements by Dr. Radhakrishnan or Dr. Niharanjan Rai, the fact remains that a common thread runs through all the languages of India. When you look at the festivals, you find what is Vaishakhi is in Punjab, that is Navavarsha in Bengal, that is Bihu in Assam, that is Onam in Kerala. So why it coincides everywhere equally? Similarly, when the Dalit movement started, it might have begun in Maharashtra, but then the movement moved, and equal fate, equal suffering, as Alok talked about suffering, that suffering is there in the entire caste system of the whole of India. Manoranjan Bepari of Bengal has been contracted by Penguin recently for publishing 12 or 13 books together. And what was he? He used to carry night soil on his head. And in his autobiography, he has written about it. And that book is now being translated, has already been translated into English and published. So a common thread runs through all our literatures, common perceptions, common feelings, the same kind of filial affection, the same kind of political reaction, the same kind of societal perception, all these things are there. And we should not have any doubt, therefore, that there is no Indian literature. There is an Indian literature. You can only say that you won't be able to pinpoint it. You won't be able to say that this is Indian literature. But remember St. Augustine, when he was asked, what is religion? He said, if you ask me, I know not. If you don't ask, I know. So don't ask me what is Indian literature. It is a composite of entire literatures of India. Thank you.
I do not think we have time for a second round, because if I start with one, we will have everybody will have to be given a chance democratically. We have had more than two perhaps points of view. Alok, of course, spoke mainly about the idea of greatness rather than about the unity or disunity or diversity of Indian literature. What is great literature ultimately, and he had his points about empathy, suffering, and the story being told in so many languages, and the whole diversity and the kind of linkages among the languages. And we had different points of view about the unity of Indian literature, as we have seen. So Ramakrishnan would emphasize the diversity and say that each language has its own independent literature. It is its own literary entity and literary culture, and we have an amalgam at the most of different literatures of India. And there was also this not exactly opposite view, but another point of view that there is an Indian literature, even though as Nirmal Kanti said, it's impossible to pinpoint and say this is Indian literature. At the same time, there are many things that connect us, many things that link literatures together. So this is an argument, I think, which will go on, and whose implications will also depend on the kind of context in which we are discussing this question. Like Ramakrishnan did, he would, at this moment of time, he would love to emphasize the diversity, because it is diversity that is in greater danger than the unity of India at present, because there is a consistent and conscious attempt to suppress our diversity and standardize our culture, standardize our languages, and create a very artificial kind of culture, which is wrongly named Hindu culture. So now I think we have some time left for questions. We have about 15 minutes for questions. If there are questions, we would like to take them. And so that is one. That's only the time for us. We have time for questions, no?
Thank you. My name is Joseph, and I am also a teacher. So thank you for introducing Indian literature very well. But my question is, what about the literature written by Indian people from abroad? There was no mention about Indians written in Indian languages or in English from abroad. And one more question is there. We are all talking about a right to education. So now I think there is a need to discuss a right to English in India, because this literature is difficult to be understood from various corners in India, because it is written in many languages. So do you argue for, or do you support that right to English? Thank you.
Somebody like to answer?
Pravasi, I think that's a very important point you made, that literatures written by Indians settled abroad, Tamil or Bengali, Urdu, Punjabi, Gujarati, Malayalam, all these are languages spoken outside Indian borders. And great literature in the quote unquote, but it is being produced and outside India as well. But the question is, I know one of the best short story writers of Gujarati is settled in USA. And this is true of many Malayalam writers, or this is true of many Hindi writers. So I think diaspora or diasporic literature has not actually got its due. Maybe there is a sense in which we need to go beyond the boundary. That's what I was trying to say. There are always multiple languages in the context of what you call a state, or you cannot totally negate the presence of other languages. The second question, right to English, my own response would be, we have accepted English on our terms. And make no mistake that English is going to stay in India, because it's not, a choice imposed from above. It is also a choice people have made. And this also has enabled us. I would always look at the enabling role of English, which, as Nehru said, would open a window to the world. And it also helps us to access knowledge. There has been an explosion of knowledge in multiple fields in the last 100 years. And but for English, Indian languages have a certain kind of backwardness which is still to be outgrown. So English plays a role in India in making available what you call knowledge in multiple fields. Maybe a day will come when a very original book will be written on economics in an Indian language, and somebody in Germany will come and learn that Indian language, but that day is far off. So I think we need English, and it's very much part of our cultural terrain.
I want to say something about that question about English. The education in English has nothing to do with the literature, with reading of literature. We're talking here about literature. And though literature is translated in English to some extent, we usually tend to talk of the Indian literature as literature written in English. So what happens is that you think that great literature can be written either in your language or in English, which is not true. You have to recognize that great literature is being written in every language in India. And then only you will be able to understand or appreciate the immense diversity and power of Indian literature composed of many languages.
Thank you, ma'am.